Okay, well, it's a great crowd. Thank you all for coming. Just a reminder, please turn off your cell phones so that they don't interfere with the speaker system. We don't end up having buzzes and cell phones basically going off here and there. Welcome to the Spring 2012 Melvin L. DeFleur Distinguished Lecture, organized by the Communication Research Center. My name is Michael Asmar, and I'm director of the CRC. The DeFleur Distinguished Lecture Series was named to honor Melvin L. DeFleur. As most of you know, DeFleur is a legendary figure in the world of mass communication theory and research. Today, I have the honor and privilege of introducing the 2012 Spring Melvin L. DeFleur Distinguished Lecturer, Professor Maxwell McCombs. Professor McCombs is internationally recognized for his research on the agenda-setting role of mass communication. It was in 1968 that Dr. McCombs, along with his colleague Don Shaw, coined the term agenda setting. Since then, more than 400 studies of agenda setting have been conducted worldwide. McCombs is the author of many books, and these have been translated into multiple languages and used worldwide as well. He is past president of the World Association for Public Opinion Research and a fellow of the International Communication Association. Professor McCombs has had a distinguished academic career. Prior to joining the University of Texas faculty in 1985, he was the John Ben Snow Professor of Research at Syracuse University. He served for 10 years as director of the News Research Center of the American Newspaper Publishers Association. He's been on the faculties of the University of North Carolina and UCLA. His earliest work in mass communication was when he worked as a newspaper reporter in New Orleans. Currently, Max McCombs holds the Jesse H. Jones Centennial Chair in Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. Please help me in welcoming Professor McCombs.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a great pleasure for me to be here at Boston University. The city of Boston has a very special place in the history of my family. My wife Betsy went to college in Boston, and my younger daughter Leslie was married in Boston. I can't claim anything quite that personal, but I'm certainly going to claim this opportunity to talk with you this afternoon about the agenda-setting role of the media as a special part of my life, especially because I have this opportunity to talk to you about two interesting new aspects of the continuing research on the agenda-setting role of the media. By way of preface, let me talk about, for just a moment, the core ideas in agenda-setting theory. The intellectual father of agenda setting is Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann's classic book, Public Opinion, published nearly 100 years ago now, began with a chapter titled The World Outside and the Pictures in Our Heads. And it was Lippmann's thesis, developed through anecdote and historical example, that the news media are the bridge between that world outside and the pictures in our head. And he also noted that public opinion is the response to the pictures in our heads. Hence, you see the link to the agenda-setting role of the media. As Michael noted, no one did very much with this idea, at least not in a very precise way, for about the next 50 years. But in 1968, Donald Shaw and I, both assistant professors at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill at that time, decided that we would try to test in a very precise way this connection between the news media's reports of the world outside and the pictures that people had in their heads. Our focus in the 1968 presidential election was on the key issues of the election, and we essentially compared two aspects. We looked first, using content analysis, at what was the pattern of coverage in the news media that Chapel Hill voters used. What was that pattern of coverage about the issues of the day? Which issue received the most attention, which the second most, third, etc. In other words, we could rank order these issues, and in the jargon of agenda setting theory, in terms of the metaphor, that constituted the media's agenda. And I always hasten to say that the way the term agenda is used in agenda setting theory is a neutral descriptive term. It is not the meaning of the word agenda as in the phrase to have an agenda. That is, the media's agenda is simply the pattern of coverage, in this case of issues, that has appeared in the media over some period of time. For the public agenda, you need to do some kind of poll or survey. And fortunately, at the time of the Chapel Hill study, there was already an excellent example in place, a question originated by the Gallup poll in the 1930s that went something like this. What do you think is the most important problem facing this country today? Shortened in the jargon now to the most important problem question, or the MIP, and we used this question among a sample of Chapel Hill voters to determine their agenda. That is, when you ask them this open-ended question, what issue was mentioned most, which issue was mentioned second most, which is third, etc. Again, you can rank order the issues, and then you can compare the two rank orders. And we found in that early Chapel Hill study a high degree of correspondence between the media's agenda and the public's agenda. And that, as Michael said, has subsequently led to hundreds of studies as we pursued that lead about the linkage between the media's agenda and the subsequent public agenda. As the theories developed, that type of study where you're looking at the issues or other topics on the media's agenda and the public agenda has come to be called first level agenda setting. First level because then by 1972 theoretically and by 76 in terms of actual empirical research, we were looking further into the nature of the linkage between media coverage and the pictures in people's heads. When the media talk about an issue or a topic, or to use an abstract theoretical term, when they talk about an object, and here I'm using the term object as social psychology uses the term attitude object. The attitude object's whatever you have an opinion about. It could be a public issue, it could be a political figure, it could be an institution, whatever you want to measure a person's opinion about. Because of our interest in public opinion and because of the history of public opinion, most agenda setting research has looked at agendas of issues, but we have also looked at other objects such as political figures or public institutions, or in some cases even countries. So it can be any set of objects you're interested in. Well, the advantage of speaking abstractly about objects is that objects have attributes. They have certain characteristics. That is, when the news media talk about some object, whatever it is, they don't just name the object. They also typically describe the object in some fashion. They tell you what some of its characteristics are. I think that's probably the easiest to see in the case of political candidates or public figures. The news reports say on the presidential candidates in the Republican Party, as they've gone through all these primaries, have reported a variety of attributes or characteristics of these candidates. It could be their stand on particular public issues. It could be their experience. It could be other aspects of their background. It could be their personality. It could be a wide variety of attributes. And just as you can rank order the objects on the media and the public agenda to determine the degree of correspondence, it's also possible to rank order these attributes to look at the attribute of the agenda of the media, which again would come primarily from a content analysis of the news coverage. You can also measure the attribute agenda of the public. The question we came up with in 1976 to do this, which is still widely used, is again an open-ended question. I'll use it in the current political situation. Suppose you had a friend who had been away for a long time and knew nothing about Mitt Romney. What would you tell them? Completely open-ended, doesn't push you in any particular direction. You might talk about his political ideology, you might talk about his background as governor of this state or in business, you might talk about his personality. You could go in many different directions. And again, the question is, to what degree does the attribute of the agenda of the media correspond to the subsequent attribute agenda of the public? And again, the short answer is there is a very, very high level of correspondence between the two. And this is called the second level of agenda setting, that is attribute agenda setting, learning about key aspects of whatever object is on the agenda. Well, that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of about 40 years of agenda setting research. Moving right along, what I would like to talk to in a bit of detail this afternoon about is two new research arenas, exploring a third level of agenda setting effects, and then in terms of the public's response to all of these effects, new research on mapping the psychology of agenda setting. Let's start with the third level. Putting together the first and second levels, then a definition of, well, what do we mean by agenda setting, or what is agenda setting? Then a general definition would be elements that are prominent in the media frequently become prominent among the public. These elements could be objects, first level agenda setting. They could be attributes, second level of agenda setting. As I describe the measurement of these, both at first level and second level, you'll note that in effect, say for first level, the issues on the agenda were pulled out of the coverage, and we tallied them and made a list according to their frequency of occurrence. We essentially do the same thing from the Gallup question. Same thing for attribute agenda setting. That is, we remove these elements from their larger context, and we simply tally the frequency with which they occur, and we rank order them on that basis. That's what I mean with the phrase you see on the screen. We are looking at discrete elements. They're taken one at a time in isolation. But in reality, these elements are bundled. That is, the typical news story about Mitt Romney is not going to just mention one characteristic, one attribute. It's going to tell you probably about several And then the question becomes, over a week's coverage or a month's coverage or many months coverage now, what kind of network, what kind of linkage occurs among these attributes? Which ones get mentioned together? Which ones are kind of out there in isolation? You know, what does the pattern of bundled attributes look like? You can do the same thing, of course, for whatever set of objects you're interested in over some period of time. What are the objects that get bundled together, that are mentioned together? Which are the ones that are out there in isolation? And so as we move to the third level, our interest is in looking at these bundles of attributes, or what we now call the network model of agenda setting. And the research question here is, just as the media can transfer the salience of an object to the public, first level, can transfer the salience of an attribute to the public, second level, can the media transfer the salience of these networks to the public? That is, if we look at not just a discrete list of attributes, but at an entire network, to what extent does the public's network reproduce the media's network? Our first step in exploring this new level, which was a little over a year ago now, was to go back to a study. We decided we would do this at the second level, at the level of attributes, and that we would take a data set in which we had already found at the second level a significant level of correspondence between the public and the media. And that we would reanalyze the same data using network analysis, that would give us some kind of benchmark for interpreting the network analysis results. Was it similar? Was it weaker? Was it stronger? That is, we needed some standard of comparison. The study that Kehan, Kim, and I had originally done was based on 2 elections in Texas, and it was traditional attribute agenda setting research. We compared the media's attribute agenda of these candidates and the public's, and the overall correlation, as you see there, was 0.65, very substantial. When Lei Gao, a doctoral student at the University of Texas, and I reanalyzed this data using network analysis, the correlation is 0.67. Essentially, we obtained the same answer. So that gave us some confidence that, at least on a statistical basis, this gave us a very, very similar answer. We've also done one additional election study with new data, the 2010 gubernatorial election in Texas, and there we got a correlation of 0.71, so it's in the same ballpark. As I said, statistically, they look very, very similar, but in terms of a qualitative comparison of the two, the network analysis is much the richer. This is the network analysis. Network analysis not only gives you a number, a correlation, it draws a picture of the network. You can see certain attributes are in the core, others are way out on the periphery. It's also possible to, as you already know now, to correlate these networks. And so we not only find a high statistical comparison, excuse me, we have a much richer picture of what the inner linkages of these networks look like. We've done one additional study since I actually prepared this presentation. Deadline, some of you are familiar with, the April 1 AEJ deadline. We made it by about 24 hours. There we went back to first level, and we took the Project for Excellence in Journalism's data on the main news stories week by week for 3 years, 2009, 2010, 2011, and we compared the patterns across those years with monthly Gallup polls across the 3 years, 36 national polls. And we did the analysis year by year. So within each year we had 52 weeks of PEJ data from the news media, and we had 12 Gallup polls. And again, we're getting correlations of averaging about 0.6566. We're again in the same ballpark, which again is particularly intriguing to us and certainly encouraging to continue on. Well, at this point, you also now know the full history of the investigation of the third level as of today. We do have several other projects in the works, including, to me, a very fascinating international study looking at the attributes of the Iraq War coverage in 2003 and 2004 in the United States and 7 other countries around the world. So perhaps the next time we at least have a conversation, we'll have a lot more findings to talk about there. Well, the interesting aspect of the third level is beyond that it qualitatively leads us into a much richer look at both media and public agendas, is that it brings together all of the different elements in agenda setting theory up to this point. That is, you can analyze sets of attributes, or you can analyze sets of objects, or ultimately we'll put all of this together and we will have a really large scale and rich picture of public opinion. If we tie all this back to Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, and particularly that phrase in the title of the opening chapter, the pictures in our heads. The original study in Chapel Hill and the other now first level studies of agenda setting in effect say, what are the pictures about? The second level of agenda setting in effect says, what are the main characteristics? What are the main attributes of those pictures? The third level gets us even closer to saying, what are the pictures? How does all this come together? And how does it impact the formation of public opinion? Okay, let me turn now to the second area, the psychology of agenda setting. Early in the history of agenda setting, David Weaver introduced a concept called need for orientation. Basically, the idea of need for orientation is based on the idea that most individuals, when they find themselves in an unfamiliar situation, are a bit uncomfortable until they kind of orient themselves to their surroundings. And this could be as varied as the first time you came to this campus and you probably had no idea where most of the buildings or offices you needed to go to really were, or maybe even which buildings and offices you needed to go to. That is, you had a need for orientation. In the political sense, in an election, especially in primary elections where often the candidates, at least at the beginning, are rather unfamiliar and unknown to many people, voters have a need for orientation. Who are these people? What are their attributes? What would they do if they were elected to office? Need for orientation, as David Weaver introduced this concept, provides, first let me define it, is defined in terms of two components, relevance and uncertainty. The key term is relevance. If you have a need for orientation towards something, it first of all says you think it's relevant. Most of us have no need for orientation at all toward any number of topics because we don't consider them relevant. That is, why do we skip over a lot of items in the newspaper every morning? Because we don't consider them relevant. I'm not interested in that. It's not relevant to me. The second component is uncertainty, and uncertainty is introduced only when relevance is high to further distinguish between the degree of need for orientation. But the key term is relevance, and both relevance and need for orientation have proven themselves quite useful over the years and research done since 1977 in identifying the level of agenda setting effects. That is, if a message is received by a public who finds it at best of low relevance, then the agenda setting impact of the media tends to be very low. On the other hand, if the relevance is very, very high, and particularly if uncertainty is also very, very high, then the level of agenda setting effects is very, very high. Typically, for instance, the correlations you've seen this afternoon are a mix of those. That is, people who have low, moderate, and high levels of need for orientation. But the key in understanding the concept is the component relevance. What do people find relevant? And what has appeared piecemeal over about the last dozen years are a series of studies that, when viewed collectively, form an interesting theoretical gestalt that furthers our understanding of this term, relevance. What makes something relevant to an individual? To what extent, then, is information about that topic or attribute likely to produce an agenda-setting effect among the public? The benchmark to this gestalt, the anchor, if you will, comes from an interesting study that Dixie Evett and Sal McGannum did 11 years ago now, in which they identified 3 dimensions of relevance. That is, they did a series of experiments at Syracuse University in which people were exposed to news stories about a wide variety of public issues, and then they were asked to fill out a battery of rating scales about how important they found them, how interesting, whether they were boring or not, a wide variety of rating scales, which they then factor analyzed. And on the basis of this factor analysis involving a dozen or so issues and many, many different measures, they identified 3 dimensions of relevance: personal relevance, social relevance, and emotional relevance. Social relevance is, I think, what we have largely assumed over the years when we ask people the Gallup MIP question: what's the most important problem facing this country today? It kind of assumes you want people to take a broad national perspective or social perspective and name a problem that's of relevance to the country, the one they think is the most relevant. But some people may indeed answer personal relevance. You know, if you're concerned about, if you're a parent with children in school and you're concerned about funding for public schools, your answer to that question, especially when it's put in a local context, might be education. It affects me. Going to the other end of the scale, older people might say Social Security. You know, I am retired or I'm nearing retirement. I'm concerned about Social Security. The emotion, and we've been somewhat aware of that for a period of time. And interestingly, about 2 years after the Evatt and Ghanem study, Fermin Boza, a sociologist in Spain, quite independent of the Evatt and Ghanem research, came up with the idea of personal relevance and social relevance and how they intersect to produce agenda-setting effects. And he did it in terms of a Venn diagram. So if you imagine one circle that's personal relevance and a second circle that's social relevance, and then you overlap them. He called that overlap area the impact area and said issues appearing in the media that have both of those motives driving them among the public will be the ones that really drive public opinion. So a very much related idea. The contribution of emotional relevance was essentially new in the literature. No one had really talked much about emotion as a separate and distinct dimension, certainly not of agenda setting, and very little in public opinion research. Interestingly, about 3 years ago now, I was looking at exactly this research and preparing a lecture for a class I was going to give at the University of Vienna. And I was on an airplane at the time, which meant I didn't have access to any books or anything. And I thought, you know, this is somewhat similar to a study I had done back in the 90s, I couldn't even remember exactly which year, that approached this idea of relevance from a very different direction. I wonder how these two studies fit together. The earlier study that I had done was a follow-up to the Gallup MIP question. You know, it occurred to me one day, well, we've been asking the Gallup MIP question for years. People name an issue. Nobody ever bothered to say, why'd you name that issue? They kind of think obvious follow-up question, but no one had ever done that, to measure this. Because if you just ask people an open-ended question, why, you often don't get terribly good answers. Well, I couldn't find the scales, so I ended up creating some of my own and measuring a series of motives of why people might have named a particular issue. So after we asked them what's the most important problem in the statewide survey in Texas, the next part said, now I'm going to read some of the reasons that other people had named that issue. How much does each one of these apply to you? Not at all, somewhat, a great deal. And so on that basis, I was able to identify 5 different motives or sources of relevance, and they seem to fit very nicely with the Ghanem and Evatt categories. Personal relevance, we found self-interest. Some people do indeed. And when you say, was it because of self-interest? Yes, it was. For other people interested in an issue and why they name it as the MIP, it's what I call avocation. They're simply just interested in that issue. For some people, the environment is that kind of issue. Doesn't impact them personally. They think there are more important other issues affecting the country overall, but they're really interested in the environment. So, personal relevance, self-interest, or avocation. Social relevance, civic duty, or peer influence. One very broad, one very narrow, and again, an emotional arousal measure. That there are issues that for some people emotionally arouse them. That they really just get very worked up over these particular issues. So that further puts some, as it were, meat on the bones of what we mean by personal relevance and social relevance. Then pursuing the idea of personal relevance, one more step. Sebastian Valenzuela in 2010 became very interested in Ronald Englehart's scales of materialistic and post-materialistic values. I won't go into a long description of those. Materialistic values, as Englehart talks about, can be interested, for instance, security, health, etc. So if you're thinking of public issues, it's in public safety, public well-being. Post-materialistic values, the environment certainly falls in that area in Engelhart's work. Sebastian found two interesting data sets, which you could do secondary analysis in Canada. One was a countrywide national study in Canada of an election, which indeed had measured the Engelhart values. So you could you could in effect assign each voter to one or the other categories. There were a few people who were kind of in the middle, they weren't either, but most people were either materialistic or post-materialistic. He also found a content analysis of the major newspapers across Canada reporting the major issues, the media's agenda of issues, if you will, during that election. It was very obvious from the content analysis that the media's agenda was the Canadian media agenda was very, very materialistic. He then looked at the degree of correspondence between the materialistic voters' agenda, because the Canadian election study also had asked the MIP question. So you have the issue agenda of materialistic voters, the issue agenda of post-materialistic voters, and the media's agenda. The high degree of correspondence is, of course, materialistic voters much more closely followed the media's agenda than did post-materialistic voters. Going to emotional relevance and getting closer to home. Joanne Miller, who's an experimental psychologist on the political science faculty at Minnesota, did an interesting agenda setting experiment a few years ago, looking at specific emotions as mediators of agenda setting effects. That is, if exposure to a particular item in the media makes you happy, makes you sad, makes you afraid, she measured a half dozen different specific emotions. Does the arousal of that specific emotion, and she also tried combinations of them, but does the arousal of that specific emotion heighten the agenda setting effect of the media, or possibly could retard the agenda setting effect of the media? She basically found that, and she was looking at crime stories, that if the crime coverage in the experiment made you afraid, or it made you sad, that this heightened the agenda setting effects. So if the emotional response was to be sad or afraid, strong effects. If it did not have that emotional effect on you, much weaker effects. and for all the other emotions that she measured. They simply didn't have any impact whatsoever. Coming very close to home, this room, Renita Coleman, who's on the Texas faculty, and Dennis Wu, who's sitting here in the front row, recently published in 2010 an interesting study analyzing 2 dimensions of affective attributes. That is, when we talk about affective attributes, I simply describe the substance of those attributes to you. You know, a person's political ideology or their background or personality. But of course, most frequently, when those attributes are reported in the media, and even more often when we ask people what they would tell their friend, those attributes have affective weights. They are presented in a positive, negative, sometimes neutral way, but most frequently in a positive or a negative way. That is, the second dimension of attributes is their affect. And Coleman and Wu's study identified, further explicated this idea of an affective attribute, that it could be a simple cognitive evaluation. I think it's positive, I think it's negative, but it also has a strictly emotional component that is quite separate from that label of positive or negative. You have the expert here, you can ask more about that. I think that's a particularly promising lead in this area. So what has evolved over a dozen years now is a theoretical gestalt in refining in many ways, explicating in much greater detail the component of relevance, which we know from decades of research helps explain the magnitude of agenda-setting effects. Now we have a dozen leads here on how to further understand exactly how people do respond to these messages of the media, why they come to regard, for example, some issues as important, and why, at the other extreme, they often ignore issues despite the media's emphasis upon them. So I think the frontier for agenda-setting research is an exciting one. We've opened, I think, some important new doors. There are a lot of interesting new routes to explore, to fit not just to political coverage, but to a wide variety of news coverage on many topics. And I urge you to follow that road. And I will end with a quote from one of my favorite fictional characters, Sherlock Holmes, who often began a new case by saying, "Come, Watson, come. The game is afoot." Thank you very much.
We've got time for questions. If anyone wants to ask questions, just raise your hand. I think Professor Tsai has volunteered to do the Oprah thing, go around with the microphone. So just raise your hand for questions. Tom, there's one here. Okay, there we go.
To start while everybody else is thinking of theirs, the way this is framed, it strikes me, even going back 100 or so years, is that the media decides to cover something, and then we see, does that picture form in the minds of whoever the recipient of that message is. But I wonder about, though, these things don't happen in that linear way. There's clearly one feeds the other, because if you're the editor of the newspaper, you're going to decide, I am going to write heavily about, it's the newspaper, or television nowadays, I'm going to cover this issue, this concern, because I know it's going to get me a lot of readers, and then you get a lot of readers, and it feeds it back. So one definitely feeds the other. In many ways, will then reflect back to the provider of that message. I don't know. I'm probably not making myself clear. These things don't happen in isolation. They feed each other.
They don't. But what we found over the years is the feedback loop's relatively weak. When you follow, particularly because of that concern. As I mentioned, the Chapel Hill study was the 1968 U.S. election. Then we did a follow-up in 72. Then in 76, because I were concerned with how does this evolve over time, we did a panel study in which we recruited voters for our panels in December of 1975. And between then and the post-election 76 interview, we interviewed them a total of 10 different times. So we were able to track the evolution of these pictures, both in the media and the public, over an extended period of time. And it becomes very clear that the media are the driving force, and that the feedback loop is relatively weak. I won't go into the particular statistical techniques we use. For those of you who are into this sort of thing, that study used cross-lag analysis, which has the advantage of pitting competing hypotheses against each other. One saying, over any particular time interval, is the media influencing the public, or is the public influencing the media, or is it reciprocal? And we found it's still largely unidirectional. It gets a little harder to measure now, of course, with the internet, because, of course, in most newsrooms, if you go in now, there's this constant monitoring of what's out there online. But the preponderance of the evidence still clears that it is a one-way street. Well, maybe if it's not a one-way, there are 5 lanes going in one direction, but only 2 coming back. The other aspect of that, so I always hesitate, to make sure people don't see this is some kind of conspiracy theory that the media are out to get us. Not only is the feedback loop weak, but if the media happen to pick an issue or topic that the public doesn't find relevant, it's not very interested in, it doesn't matter how much it's on the media agenda. It just doesn't go across. And there is one particular topic in the recent history of U.S. media, and unfortunately for the reputation of our country, I can use this example anywhere in the world, and most places it's getting a little dated now. For a long time I could use the quote code name, and if I was speaking, say, in South America to an audience that was hearing a translation of my remarks into Spanish, I always knew exactly when the translator translated the code phrase. The code phrase, you'll recognize this, Tom, all Monica, all the time. That phrase was known all over the world, I get, as soon as you say that, first you see smiles, then you see laughter, whether you're in South America or Eastern Europe or wherever. There was an issue, it was certainly on the media's agenda. It never hit the public's agenda at all as a public issue. Because if you interview people, in effect, in so many words they say, it's not relevant. It's not a public issue. Even in conservative countries in South America, I get some amazingly blunt answers from students about why it was none of the media's business. But people simply, they say, it's a sexual scandal. It does not bear on governing the country. You know, it may say a lot about Bill Clinton as an individual, but it's not a public issue, and we don't, therefore, in fact, there was no real agenda setting in that case. And you find some of that for other issues. That's by far the most notorious example. Other questions?
So some of the later research on agenda setting seems to have focused on group differences, like the Valenzuela study, where we grouped the voters according to their values, and some voters had the media's agenda and some voters didn't. Do you think there might be other group differences, like age even, or basic demographic measures, considering how much more media there is now?
The demographic question's been pretty well explored, and by and large, there simply are not the demographic differences. I think you really have to get into the differences such as the one Sebastian looked at, where you're dealing with personal values. Don Shaw has an interesting set of data from the last election. They're in-depth interviews. And he's going to be looking at those for people whose political views are very much on the right or the left. There again, I think we will find they may not follow the lead of the mainstream media, but in that case there may be a kind of niche agenda setting going on. They are following the agenda of particular media on the right or the left. That suggestion, let me just comment briefly on this, because there may be other questions. There is a question, well, now that there's so many media channels, what happens to this agenda setting? Well, with the media, is it diminished? Does it disappear? And the evidence today suggests, no, it does not. One of the more interesting studies, one that Renita Coleman and I did, had data from statewide surveys in both North Carolina and Louisiana. And we divided this by generations. We looked at young adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults. And we looked at how well they matched the agenda of the major newspapers in those states. As we deliberately picked newspapers saying, okay, that's the most conservative version of the agenda. And we know an awful lot of young adults do not read newspapers. So you say those correlations. The correlations were almost perfect for the older two generations in both states. They were only about 20 points lower for young adults. So even though they may not in many cases read a newspaper, either the paper version or the online version, we get a kind of reinforcement or echo effect in many of the other media channels. They, in effect, are recycling the agenda of those newspapers. To me, one of the more fascinating studies in that regard was done about 2 years ago now, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, by Hewlett Packard. They were interested in, well, on Twitter, when people do talk about something other than what they had for breakfast, where they're going to meet their friend for a drink, what topics do they talk about? What kind of public affairs topics are cycling through Twitter? The methodology is kind of awesome. Said Hewlett Packard did this. They downloaded 16 million tweets, and they went through 16 million tweets. They found that small percentage that did talk about public affairs topics, they essentially echoed the mainstream media. People were repeating things they had seen in the newspaper or on television. So obviously I like metaphors, and the metaphor I kind of think of now is the chorus of media voices is much larger but to a considerable degree, it's still a chorus. They're still kind of saying, for the most part, the same thing. Now, at the political extremes, there have always been nonconformists, let's call them media, who push particular issues that are of interest to people on the right or people on the left. Those media perhaps are indeed stronger today. But for the population as a whole, it still seems to be the media chorus that's having the impact.
So I'm interested in pink slime.
Okay.
I don't know if you've heard that. It's been in the media. It's been covered by newspapers. How did it get there? Is this an example of an issue moving from the public agenda to the media agenda? I think some of the companies that are going out of business because of pink slime might be interested in your answer.
I don't know of any specific data on that, and there are instances of of the media picking up on some particular public interest. There is a volume of research that looks at sources of the media agenda, and often for many of these, when you kind of track these things back upstream, you find sometimes, well, not always, I start to say obscure publication. Sometimes not so obscure. That somebody somewhere wrote an article on this or produced a piece on this on TV, and somehow it caught the attention. Pink slime, I have no idea, but probably one of the most common examples, and we're in the right part of the country for this, if you kind of track medical reporting over long periods of time, how do certain medical stories get into the media mainstream? Try the New England Journal of Medicine. It is a major agenda setter for medical news. For new issues on the agenda, historically, the New York Times has played that particular role. So that's another interesting aspect is to what, how does the media agenda get organized? And it's an area in agenda setting theory referred to as intermedia agenda setting, the extent to which the media set each other's agenda. Those of you who work as journalists are quite aware, journalists watch to see what other journalists are doing. Sometimes to provoke a discussion on this point, I say, journalists are great plagiarists. They copy what others are doing. And for many years, I had a close friend who was editor of the Austin American Statesman, the daily newspaper in Austin, Texas. And I used to tease him that he had the second most important job on the newspaper. When I first said it, he said, "You think the publisher's more important?" I said, "I'm not counting the publisher." I said, "You're second most." He said, "Who's first?" Well, the Austin American Statesman prints the Southwest edition of the New York Times, and they print it before they print the local paper. I said, the number one guy is down in the press room, and he scoops up the first 100 copies of the New York Times off the press and takes them up to the newsroom. And if over the years, and this is still largely true, the physical design of the two newspapers is totally different. If you were looking at them on a table and you were standing back 10 feet, they don't look anything alike. You walk up closer and you start looking at the placement of the stories. And unless there's a big blockbuster local story, they're going to have, even day by day, a highly similar agenda. So the New York Times historically has played an important role. And that in itself, particularly for those of us in journalism, I think it's a particularly fascinating area, this interplay influence within the media
Any other questions? Got one in the front.
Hi, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts in terms of the correlation between agenda setting and desensitization, particularly in the recent story that happened just earlier this week in the campus shooting in Oakland, and how it did not receive the media coverage as comparison to, say, Virginia Tech a few years ago, even dating all the way back to Columbine, and if media coverage on a certain topic is having a residual effect of desensitizing society to topics.
That's an interesting, very interesting question. I don't know of any, I'm not familiar in detail with that particular research. I think it's an interesting hypothesis, and it could be a kind of inadvertent byproduct. That if you spend, well, think of in terms of emotional relevance, maybe the first time, even the second or third time, that kind of story appears, you do. For a lot of people, you get this emotional surge. And maybe after the fourth or fifth time, you're just not getting that response anymore. I think the other parallel I can think of is that, again, I don't know any hard and fast research on it, but I've always had the impression for any war that lasts a long time. I think back to the Vietnam War, the Iraq War. After a while, people, they kind of become inured. And I found toward the end of the Iraq War, I would read the lead 2 or 3 paragraphs to kind of say, well, is there something really unusual or new there? But, the New York Times story went on for, 10, 12 inches at least, just about every day. I just didn't read it anymore. Kind of I hate to say this, it's kind of the same kind of wear out that advertising people talk about. If you keep showing the same ad, or even the ads predicated on kind of the same theme after a while, they just don't work anymore. So that's a fascinating area, I think, to look at. That kind of negative agenda setting. Something's, it works to establish salience up to a point, then actually might begin to literally drive the salience down.
Much as we'd like to stay even longer, I think time's up. Help me thank Professor McCombs. 2012, spring 2012 for thank you all for coming.